Hey, beautiful souls. I think, I know this topic is going to be really important because it affects our society a lot more than we realize. And I don't care what spectrum you're at in it, I think everybody, including you, will benefit from this. So, what inspired all of this to begin with? There was a post in regards to emotional abuse and that we should educate ourselves. Yeah, we should. But my concern was the way it was broadcasted. Is from a highly volumed follower, therefore creating a lot of much of a stir. And in sociology, we consider that accepting the expert's advice without understanding all the details. I do think we need to understand these details. If you can pinpoint what emotional abuse is, high five to you. But it goes much further than just educating yourself, preparing. Emotional abuse is more often than not very covert, very passive aggressive. What this means is that you, oftentimes a victim, will get a compliment with a backlash. Now, do we consider that abuse? Well, in today, our social norm is often with individuals that have sarcasm. Can't you take a joke? We won't label that as emotional abuse. But that's what happens in this dynamic. If you're, again, so are you familiar with the boiling frog? Essentially what it means is that the frog is in the pot and the heat starts rising. So therefore the frog is dying a slow death and has no idea what the hell's happening. This is what happens in these relationship dynamics. While the temperature is rising, per se, the abuse continues and there's bonds that are happening. These bonds are associated with trauma bond, or aka Stockholm Syndrome. How does this happen? There are dopamine and oxytocin levels within the brain that are on high wire as there are roller coasters, and from anybody's point of view, every relationship has high or lows, right? Everybody has differences. So everybody's trying to work through it. The difference is, this is a lot different than your normal. There's extremely highs and lows causing these chemicals in our brains to be released. Again, they're covert, they're passive. It's not direct, you're a piece of shit, so to say, right? So by the time the victim kind of gets a grasp on what the hell is happening, and you know, when I say covert, we're talking there's gaslighting, there's the word toss, and normal people, we want to help to understand each other. We want to try to communicate. And some people are more difficult to understand, but if you love somebody, you try to get their perception and you try to be patient with them. This is how all this is happening. Once the victim comes to terms that there's something off balance and this is not right, by that time, more than often than not, they're in a world of depression. They have managed to seclude themselves from society, their friends, their family. And clarity is clear to non-existent because they are in such a, because during the Stockholm or the bonding, the brain is literally being rewired. Now, how Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bond happens, this is normal activity for a healthy brain. Therefore, it's not your fault. This is how a healthy brain reacts under abnormal situations. How do we distinguish it as abnormal? Well, is it normal to have some sarcasm here or there? Is it normal for, you know what I mean? So it was covert. It was passive aggressive. It wasn't necessarily direct. So when the victim does find, and let me also say this, there's a dependency that happens, and I'm not talking about codependency. in this chemical reaction, with the chemical release, the victim becomes addicted, a dependency in the addiction to the abuser. So by the time they're kind of even coming to terms of what's happening, they're secluded, they're in depression, they can't think clear, they are having a cognitive dissonance at this point, going, I know this and I feel that, what? And that's where the abuse begins to get more and more, like, where everybody else might, when you might look into a situation and go, they're emotionally abusing. Well, the victim is in a whirlwind at this point. It doesn't happen, like, you don't go into a relationship thinking, hey, like, you're abusing me, aren't you? I mean, it would be that great. Once the victim does find the courage, if they can get out, I mean, we can't ask somebody to just, you don't want to ask an individual just to leave. I mean, obviously you want to support them, help them, but to leave and not understand is worse than just your typical breakup. Because there is an actual addiction. The brain has been wired a lot different than that of a love bond. This is a abuse bond. It is the trauma bond. It's the Stockholm syndrome. And it's literally equivalent to asking a heroine or anybody else that's addicted to a highly addictive drug to go cold turkey. It is painful. It is excruciating. On top of that, you're trying to reconnect cognitive wires. I mean, there's a whole lot of cognitive dissonance. And the brain, the chemicals, the addiction for it. Many of these victims come out and are working on, bridging the cognitive dissonance. They're also facing CPTSD, other PTSDs, and looking around the world around them and trying to figure out how to fit in again. Yes, and at that point, I think it's essential that, especially for the victim, to become very educated as to what's happening, because they have to be able to repair that cognitive dissonance, bridge that gap of what happened. But wouldn't it be easy to go out there and let's just educate everybody this is emotional abuse? Well, it doesn't happen very directly. What we need to educate on. So I guess first and foremost, if you have never experienced emotional abuse, I'm like, that's amazing, and I hope you never do. I would never wish that on anybody. The difference between emotional abuse and physical abuse, there's not much of a difference. Other than with physical abuse, there's tangible evidence. Emotional abuse, there's no tangible evidence. It's an intangible warfare that the victim goes through. And we need to be very sensitive to that. And because the victim comes out and is fighting all this, they do feel lonely. They feel secluded. They're fighting a withdrawal from the abuser that they really want. And they don't know why. They can't wrap their head around it. And I think that's why it's so important that if you haven't been abused, maybe we should understand it before we just say, like, that's ridiculous, and why would you want to be with somebody that treats you like shit, and this and that. It's much deeper than just what we perceive. The emotional abuse goes into the mind, and it affects you on a psychological level, the mental, the biological, the emotional, the spiritual even. I mean, all of it is completely misconstrued, and it takes a lot of work to bring yourself back into, like, society, and it requires a massive amount of focus to not label everybody the same way, because, their abuser was sweet and nice to them too. There was love bonding, you know what I mean? The love bombing is also what happens there too. So for the person that's undergone a emotional abusive relationship, everything looked fine in the beginning. They were in a pot like the frog as the temperature was slowly rising, unaware of what was happening. For any of the people coming out, so much love to you and sending so much healing. And the first and most important thing we can do is to heal. We need to heal. And I can't advocate this enough. Once we get through the healing, which means, I'm going to be straight with you, the first thing you have to do is get rid of all the toxicity, and it's a process. I mean, the no contact from the actual abuser. Anybody else that brings you down, your whole surrounding has got to be serene. You have got to be sensitive and gentle with yourself, because you want to beat yourself up. You're living in guilt. You're living in shame. Healing is a utmost, like, profound thing. And once you get through the healing, there has to be a line of forgiveness. We have to be able to rise ourselves above. And this is what I'm finding also in my studies, is there's so much hurt and so much pain that I see victims that are struggling to rise above. And hurt people. The difference being is that the reason you fell into an emotional abusive relationship to begin with is because your heart is so damn big. Because you were able to try to see from a different angle. You had so much compassion. And you have to find that essence again. And I know pain can change you. It can. But we have to be able to take that and take it as wisdom and integrate it into our life with a newfound discernment. And if we want to talk about education, my friends, we need to talk about, because nobody cares unless you've been through it. Unfortunately, like, that's the fact of it. And then people make ignorant comments on social media about how I can't understand how somebody could be in an emotional, abusive relationship. Well, educate yourself first, guys. There needs to be some compassion before we throw out statements like that. Because the work is massive. And for the victims, we need to rise above. Because this hurt and anger, it's only eating you up. It's finding a way to forgive. And I believe, for myself, is to give it to the divine. Please take this and transcend it for me. And believe it or not, here's a little secret, guys. The divine wisdom, the universe, all the atoms of this world resides in you. Therefore, the divine, when you give it to the divine, that's a part of you. You are learning how to alchemize this, making you very powerful. And I mean, in a very humble way, you get to transcend out of it. And you come back actually, you're wiser, you've learned discernment, and that's what we need to teach people is discernment. Have you ever had a class on discernment? Do we have classes on self-love and self-esteem, and where do we lie, like, where's that deep line of boundaries? That's what we can give gratitude and appreciation to the abuser. Yeah, did they make our life completely different? Yeah, but, so from both perspectives, if you've never been abused and you can just, you look into a situation, you're like, why? Please educate yourself. It's much more than just the victim putting up with shit. There's mental programming happening. There's different chemical releases happening. And more often than not, it's covert. It's so important because if somebody popular puts out a statement like that and everybody just swooshes in, again, sociology, the social expert advice, let's ensure, and I challenge you guys, look it up. The dopamine and oxytocin, that's what's released in the brain during these trauma bonds. The Stockholm syndrome, that's what causes this addiction, the highs and the lows. I definitely challenge you to, please, question what I have to say. But that is, I've done a lot of research, I've been through it, I've experienced it, and for people to make ignorant comments, please educate yourself. For the victims, so much love to you. If you've gotten out, if you're trying to get out, if you're trying to wrap your head around it, heal. But also, let's all rise above it, especially if you are the victim. You've got to become better than the abuser. And that's just on a different thing, but that's what I've been seeing is a lot of letting the hate become a part integrated with us, and we can't live like that. We need to rise above it. Okay, that's my rampage, guys, but I think it's really important. So important. Before we just accept anything as truth and just like it because somebody popular says something. So much love. Till next time.